Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 7th of April, where I wanted to talk about some of the language in Richard II. I left you with an attendance question about whether or not Richard II could be considered a tragic hero. And of course, when we think about the elements of a tragic hero, someone who is above and beyond the ordinary, and I suppose Richard might qualify for that, in that he comes from royal blood, but he certainly doesn't seem to have a character that's above and beyond the ordinary. This individual experiences a downfall. And yes, we can say that Richard indeed does experience a downfall and that he loses his kingdom. The downfall occurs for two reasons. One, because of outside forces. Now, this can be a little bit trickier with Richard II, in that I don't know if we could necessarily call Bolingbroke an outside force unless Bolingbroke has been plotting from the very beginning of the play to try to usurp Richard. And also, the character falls because of a flaw or flaws. And obviously, we see lots of flaws within Richard's character. He makes quite a few mistakes in terms of rule. He's arrogant, he's petty, he's self-centered, and the list goes on and on. The version we saw with the BBC Derek Jacobi playing Richard II, plays Richard as a rather foppish, self-centered king. I've seen other productions that have played Richard in a more serious way. Richard, of course, was a boy king. This is from the history, and ultimately relied on counselors and family members to rule before he became of age. So the idea is that Richard never really learned how to rule, and that others were ruling for him. And then when he took over, he basically surrounded himself with flatterers and with friends rather than with individuals who had true political understanding and knowledge. Now, probably the biggest key with the tragic hero is, does the tragic hero accept responsibility for their fall? And I don't know if we can necessarily say that. Certainly by the ending of the play, Richard is rather humbled. One of my favorite lines in the play is when Richard is in his prison cell and says, "I've wasted time, and now time doth waste me." And I think we can feel a certain sense of pity. It's one of the first times, perhaps the only time actually, that we've seen Richard by himself, and we see him engaged in self-reflection. But that said, he seems to be more concerned about his own plight than he does about the ruin that he has made the kingdom, as Gaunt, as a wonderful symbol for England itself, as it's becoming gaunt on its deathbed, warns Richard. And again, in one of Richard's fatal flaws, he ignores Gaunt's warnings and continues on with his own quest of power and ambition and glory. So we know that Shakespeare oftentimes will play with definitions. He doesn't necessarily have to follow all of the criteria, but it does strike me that Richard, and as we continue on with the tragedies, which are based on the idea of tragic hero, and for us, that'll be Macbeth. And I deliberately chose Macbeth as our next play because it is Shakespeare's shortest play. So I wanted us to make up a little bit of time as well. And then finally ending with Othello, which is really a retelling, if you will, of Much Ado About Nothing, but with a very negative ending. And that basically would put closure onto our tragedies in the tragedy section. But going back to the idea of quotes with Richard, and this is perhaps one of Shakespeare's most lyrical plays, and Richard is a man of language rather than a man of action. And if he had perhaps taken action earlier on in the play, the end result might have been different. And in fact, Richard has some of the most beautiful poetry in the play. But you'll see in the notes below that I've highlighted several passages of importance. The first being Act 1, Scene 1, line 178. And in this particular scene, it's Mowbray who's speaking. And of course, we talked about the uncertainty of motivation that both Mowbray and Bolingbroke might have. It could be that Mowbray is trying to hide a treasonous act and might have even worked with Richard. Or it could be that Bolingbroke is trying to seize an opportunity to frame Mowbray and therefore try to usurp the kingdom. Or perhaps it's a combination of the both. But at any rate, the idea of reputation is a major theme that we've seen throughout the semester. Think about the importance of reputation, for instance, in Much Ado About Nothing, when we basically have a hero whose reputation is destroyed, and ultimately that means that her life is destroyed as well. And in Act 1, Scene 1, line 178, Mowbray is lamenting the fact that his reputation has been destroyed. And he says, basically, for Gloucester's death I slew him not, but to my own disgrace neglected my sworn duty in that case. For you, my noble lord of Lancaster, the honorable father to my foe, once did I lay ambush for your life, a trespass that does vex my grieved soul. In other words, he's confessing that he has once engaged in treasonous activities, but not this time. But ere I last received the sacrament, I did confess it, and exactly begged your grace's pardon, and I hope I had it. This is my fault. And for the rest appealed, it issues from the rancor of a villain. So at this particular point, he's talking about the idea that he's innocent. And then in Act 1, Scene 1, line 178, he says, my dear Lord, the purest treasure mortal times afford is spotless reputation. That away, men are but gilded loam or painted clay. Again, we can hear the rhyme there as well. And then when we continue on, Act 1, Scene 3, line 236. This is where Gaunt is talking about that he is in the unenviable position of being both a father to Mowbray, or a father to Bolingbroke, I'm sorry, but also a judge. And he needs to take sides. And we know that Richard is the God anointed, so that ultimately all of Richard's subjects should basically follow Richard's rule without any kind of hesitancy. But of course, he also has the responsibility for trying to protect his son. And this is in Act 1. Scene 3, line 236 or so, where he's talking about the idea. Gaunt says, things sweet to taste, prove in digestion sour. You urge me as a judge, but I'd rather you would bid me argue, like a father. Oh, to have been a stranger, not my child. To smooth his fault, I should have been more mild. A partial slander sought I to avoid, and in the sentence, my own life destroyed. And in this particular instance, we get references to appetite. There's lots of references to appetite and to eating in Shakespeare's plays. We see it more in a positive way in Shakespearean comedies, definitely in a much more negative way in this history, and certainly in a negative way when we get to the tragedies. And then perhaps one of the most famous speeches of Richard II, and this is Gaunt's deathbed speech. And this happens in Act 2, Scene 1, line 31 or so, where Gaunt is basically saying, methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell of him his rash, fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves. Small showers last long, but sudden storms he tires betides, that spurs too fast betimes. With eager feeding food doth choke the feeder. Light vanity, insatiate cormorant, consuming means, soon preys upon itself. The royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home, for Christian service as true chivalry, as in the sepulchre and stubborn jury of the world's ransom. Blessed Mary's Son, this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation throughout the world, is now leased out, I die pronouncing it, like a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. This is the first place we get to a semicolon. Up until this point, it's been all commas. This is an incredibly long speech. It's an opportunity to praise England and England's former glory. It's an opportunity to use bestial and animal imagery as well as food imagery, this idea of prey and appetite. And it's also an opportunity to talk about reputation. So it's an incredibly important speech. And we'll see lots of references to the idea of disease and decay, both in the histories and also in the tragedies. And we see that in Act 2, Scene 1, line 93, when there is a reference to the idea of disease that is consuming the kingdom, when Gaunt says, "Now he that made me knows I see thee ill, ill in myself to see, and in thee, seeing ill, thy deathbed is no lesser than thy land, wherein thou liest in reputation sick, and thou, too careless patient as thou art, committedst thy anointest body to the cure of those physicians that first wounded thee. 1,000 flatterers sit within thy crown, whose compass is no bigger than thy head. And yet, in so small a verge, the waste is no whit lesser than thy land." And as we continue on in this particular speech, we see how Richard completely ignores it. And York, in Act 2, Scene 1, line 163, is trying to be reasonable and rational, and he is torn between allegiances with Richard and also understanding that Richard is a terrible ruler and that he needs to do what is in the best interest of England. And York is urging patience. In Act 2, Scene 1, line 163 or so, York basically laments, "How long shall I be patient? Oh, how long shall rendered duty make me suffer wrong? Not Gloucester's death, not Hereford's banishment, not Gaunt's rebukes, nor England's private wrongs, nor the prevention of poor Bolingbroke about the marriage, nor my own disgrace hath ever made me sour my patient cheek, or been one wrinkle on my sovereign's face. I am the last noble of Edward's sons, of whom thy father, Prince of Wales, was first." And then he continues on and talking about how ultimately he's seeing the destruction and disintegration of the kingdom. Now, we see Richard engage in some public laments in Act 3. We know that in the pyramid structure of dramas, Act 3 would be the pinnacle or the height of conflict. And this is where we see the transition from Richard to Bolingbroke in terms of the throne. And Richard acts very unkingly when he is confronted with the reality that Bolingbroke has returned with a large army, and Richard has basically lost most, if not all, of his support. And in Act 3, Scene 2, line 47 or so, Richard is lamenting the idea that he's in such a terrible position, and he has to even be reminded by his few supporters that he needs to act, at least publicly, in a dignified way, because he still is the king. But we know that ultimately Richard is well aware that this is going to be short-lived. And what Richard says is, "So when this thief, this traitor Bolingbroke, who all this while hath revelled in the night, while we were wandering with the Antipodes, shall see us rising in our throne, the cast his treasons will sit blushing in his face, not able to endure the sight of day, but self-arighted tremble at his sin. Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord." And remember, we had talked about that Richard is indeed God anointed. And there's lots of Christian imagery and references in the play to reinforce that. And he continues on and says, "For every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Then if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right." And then right after that, we see Richard's vacillation. Act 3, Scene 2, line 83. And here Richard is saying, "I'd forgot myself. Am I not the king? Awake, thou coward majesty, thou sleepest. Is not the king's name 20,000 names? Arm, my name. A puny subject strikes at thy great glory." And then immediately after that, in Act 3, Scene 2, line 129, references to Jesus and Judas. And actually, Richard dares to say that he's being persecuted in the way that Jesus himself had been persecuted. And this is where he says, "O villains, vipers, damn it, without redemption, dogs easily won to fawn on any man, snakes in my heart blood warm that sting my heart, 3 Judases, each one thrice worse than Judas, would make thy peace terrible hell." And then Richard's self-pity. And this is in Act 3, Scene 2, line 144. And notice how quickly this is going. And Richard says, "Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills. And yet not so, for what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies to the ground, our lands, our lives, and all our Bolingbroke's? And we see his self-pity when he continues on and he says, and tell sad stories of the kings of death, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king sits death in his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp. And he continues on and says, I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. And the response is, my lord, wise men never listen wail their woes. In other words, get it together. And once Richard finds out that York has joined Bolingbroke's side, then he's back in self-despair when he says in Act 3, Scene 3, line 206, what comfort have we now? By heaven, I'll hate him everlastingly, that bids me be of comfort of any more. Go to Flint Castle. There I'll pine away a king. Woe, slave, shall kingly woe obey. That power I have discharge, and let them go to eat the land that hath some hope to grow. For I have none. Let no man speak again to alter this, for counsel is but vain. And again, you can see throughout all of these episodes that Richard really does have a quite poetic slant to him, and probably would be better suited as a poet than he ever would be as a ruler. York ultimately joining Bolingbroke in Act 3, Scene 2, line 200 is going to be basically the impetus for the rest of the play, because now individuals are going to have to, in one way or another, choose a position. And that's going to lead to a very unsettled ending, which means that the history plays can continue when Bolingbroke, who is now Henry IV, we can see his story, and one that is going to be an uneasy rule. But in Act 3, Scene 2, I believe it is, and line 200 or so, is where we learn that Uncle York is joined with Bolingbroke, and all your honorable castles yielded up, and all of your southern gentlemen in arms upon his party. That was Scroop who gave that information to Richard. And then finally, Richard has to have some level of submission. That's in Act 3, Scene 3, line 143 or so. And he continues his lament where he talks about, let them tell sad tales about me by the fire. Again, he is very, very self-indulgent. When we get to something like Act 3, Scene 3, line 140 or so, what must the king do now? Must he submit? The king shall do it. Must he be deposed? The king shall be contented. Must he lose the name of king? And God's name let it go. I'll give my jewels for a set of beads, my gorgeous palace for a hermitage, my gay apparel for an alsman's gown, my figured goblets for a dish of wood, my scepter for a palmer's walking staff, my subjects for a pair of carved saints, and my large kingdom for a little grave, a little grave, an obscure grave. And I'll be buried in the king's highway, some way of common trade, where a subject's feet may hourly trample on the sovereign's head. And he goes on and on and on again, lamenting his poor state. So we can't say that at this point that Richard has shown any kind of qualities whatsoever that would seem to indicate that he does deserve indeed to be king. And the garden scene is a wonderful scene in this particular play, as I had indicated, because if nothing else, it's such a change in tone. This is a very dark, very depressing, very claustrophobic play. Much of it occurs indoors or occurs during night. The garden scene is filled with light, and this is in Act 3, Scene 4, line 29. And we can see how, and this is very typical of Shakespeare, some of the lower orders, in this instance the gardeners, who are supposed to be lower on the chain of being, have the political insight to understand that tending to a garden is very comparable to tending to a kingdom. And you need to weed, because if you don't, then ultimately that's going to lead to its destruction. It's also an important scene because the queen gets to overhear what's happening in the kingdom. And while we've spent 2 plays thus far talking about strong women and also weak women in Midsummer Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing, notice how male-centric Richard II is. It's definitely a play of patriarchy and political patriarchy. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why it ends in such a tragic way. The Queen is not at all involved in political affairs and basically has to learn things secondhand and thirdhand. Now, the historical story of Richard was that his queen was a child bride and that this was a unification of 2 different countries, France and England. But of course, Shakespeare plays around with the historical facts and for dramatic purposes. So we get a queen that's more age appropriate for Richard. And the idea is that if we see any softer side to Richard, is with his relationship with his queen, because there does seem to be a true level of affection between the 2 of them. But that garden scene, Act 3, Scene 4, and this is in line 29, wherein the gardener is basically talking about that, and let's see if I can find this here. Go bind thou up young dangling apricots, which like unruly children make their sires stoop with oppression of their prodigal weight. Give some supportance to the bending twigs. Go thou, and like an executioner, cut off the heads of those too fast-growing sprays that look too lofty in our commonwealth. All must be even in our government and thus employed. I will go root away the noisome weeds that without profit suck the soil's fertility from wholesome flowers. And basically what we're talking about are Richard and his flatterers that basically have destroyed the garden, the Eden, if you will. And you remember Gaunt talking about England being a demi-paradise and an Eden. This Eden of England. And then, of course, the loss of the crown. And this is Act 4, Scene 1, line 162. It's incredibly visual, incredibly melodramatic. In the BBC version that we saw, you can see how both Bolingbroke and Richard are literally holding the crown as we see the transfer from one to the other. And we also see how Richard says he is really willing to relinquish the crown, and then immediately afterwards says, no, 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 I'm not willing to relinquish the crown, as we see a good amount of typical Richard self-pity. This is, again, Act 4, Scene 1, around line 162 or so, when Richard says, Alack, why am I sent for to a king? Before I have shook off my regal thoughts, wherewith I reigned, I hardly yet have learned to insinuate, flatter, bow, or bend my knee, give sorrow leave a while to tutor me to this submission. Yet I well remember the favor of these men. Were they not mine? Did they not sometimes cry, All hail, to me? So Judas did to Christ. But he and 12 found truth in all but one, and I and 12,000 none. God save the king. Will no man say amen? Am I both priest and clerk? Well then, amen. God save the king, although I be not he, and yet amen, if heaven do think him me. And I don't know if you've noticed the use of doubling in this particular play. Not only do we have the doubling of Richard and Bolingbroke, but how often Richard's speeches are about doubles and the contrast between the 2. Finally, we know that Richard does have to give everything up, and he says he is willing in an uneasy fashion to transfer the power. This is in Act 4, Scene 1, line 200 or so. Therefore, for I resign to thee. Now mark me how I will undo myself. I give this heavy weight off my head and this unwieldy scepter from my hand. The pride of kingly sway from our heart. With mine own tears I wash away my balm. With mine own hands I give away my crown. With mine own tongue deny my sacred state. With mine own breath release all duteous oaths. All pomp and majesty I do forswear. All manners, rents, revenues I forego. My acts, decrees, and statutes I deny. God pardon all oaths that are broken to me. So he's willing to give it all up, but again, he doesn't have an option. As I had indicated last class, it seems as if Richard willingly relinquishes, but he's quite aware that if Bolingbroke has returned with an army there, he really doesn't have any kind of choice. He being Richard doesn't have any kind of choice, but basically to relinquish what he's done. And then we see how Richard has to experience public humiliation. Act 4, Scene 1, line 276. He's paraded around in the streets where garbage is thrown upon him. So we see how easy it is for him to go from the pinnacle of rule to the bottom, basically, of the chain of being, if you want to think about it from that perspective. And at this particular point, we can say that Bolingbroke shows perhaps a bit of mercy, because he doesn't necessarily want Richard to have to read all of his offenses in a public way. Nevertheless, Bolingbroke does allow that public humiliation. Act 4, Scene 1, line 276 or so. And this is where we are told, if I can find this, Act 4, Scene 1, line 276, Richard's public humiliation, where initially he's being given a mirror to read his sins, and he doesn't want to do something like that. I believe the humiliation comes shortly thereafter. And what we see after that is that Richard is trying to console his queen. And this is in Act 5, Scene 1, line 16, which goes to show that perhaps there is a softer side to Richard, because we can see that he isn't all about his self-centered petty rule. And in Act 5, Scene 1, line 37 is where we also see some more lamenting going on from Richard, where this is where he says, "Let them tell sad tales about me." Act 5, Scene 1, line 37 or so. And that he suspects that what's going to be happening there is that these sad tales that are told about him will be done by women by the campfire as they recollect his former glory. And he says, "Think I am dead, and that even here thou takest as from my deathbed thy lasting leave. In winter's tedious nights sit by the fire with good old folks, and let them tell these tales of woeful ages long ago betide. And ere thou bid good night, to quiet their griefs, tell thou the lamentable tale of me, and send the hearers weeping to their beds. And why the senseless brands will sympathize, the heavy accent of thy moving tongue, and in compassion weep the fire out, and in some will mourn in ashes, some coal black, for the deposing of a rightful king." Now, of course, that's the crux of it. Richard is rightful, at least by blood right, but he isn't necessarily rightful in terms of his ability to rule. And we were talking about some of the political controversies going on during Shakespeare's time, which we will also revisit with Macbeth, which was a play written after Elizabeth's death. So now we've got a new monarch in place, but King James. But at this particular point, the populace in Britain is quite concerned about what's going to happen with Queen Elizabeth. She's never married, so she doesn't have a direct heir. And certainly from a political perspective, it was very smart of her not to marry so that she could retain political power, or she would have lost that if she had taken a husband and that would have become king. But because she doesn't have a direct heir, either male or female, lots of speculation and concern about who will be taking over the kingdom. Should it be the one with the closest blood relation? And even that could be disputed because there wasn't a direct heir. Or should it be someone who perhaps is further off in terms of blood right, but has a greater ability to rule? And of course, we know that politics were very dangerous to discuss during this time period, so individuals didn't necessarily have these conversations publicly. Shakespeare, in his very clever way, has this conversation in Richard II. The question of who has the right to rule, but the way that Shakespeare protects himself is by basically embedding that question into a previous monarch, one from hundreds of years before, Richard II. So that if Shakespeare were ever accused to be raising many of the similar questions that the ending of Queen Elizabeth's reign had raised, he could easily protect himself and say that he was just reviewing the actual British history of the time, and it was merely coincidental. So this is a wonderful way for Shakespeare to directly address the political turmoil of his time without directly addressing the political turmoil of his time. And in Act 5, Scene 2, line 23, we get a reference to metadrama. This is very Shakespearean, where he will oftentimes make reference to the fact that what we are watching is a drama. And York says, "As in a theater the eyes of men, after a well-graced actor leaves the stage, are idly bent on him that enters next, thinking his prattle to be tedious, even so or more with contempt Men's eyes did scowl on gentle Richard. No man cried God save him, no joyful tongue gave him welcome home. But dust was thrown upon his sacred head, and with such gentle sorrow he shook it off, his face still combating with tears and smiles the badges of his grief and patience, that had not God, for some strong purpose, steel the hearts of men, they must have perforce have melted, and barbarism itself have pitied him. So this is where we get reference to the idea that garbage has been thrown on poor Richard and that he has been humiliated. And we also see in Act 5 how literally families are torn apart in terms of their allegiances. While York is supporting one faction, his son, Omer, is supporting another faction. Omer is still supporting Richard II, while York is supporting Bolingbroke. York discovers this and basically is going to go to Bolingbroke to have his son executed. Omer's mother, and this could be a place where we could say we are witnessing an episode of strength from a female, begs for her son's life and convinces Bolingbroke to show mercy and to at least pardon Omer. This is in Act 5, Scene 3, line 131. And we can take this particular act of pardon in multiple ways. It could be that Bolingbroke is showing mercy as a good king. It could be that Bolingbroke is showing empathy because, of course, these are his family relations. It could be that Bolingbroke is showing political savvy and he wants these individuals to be politically indebted to him. So if he issues a pardon, then he can use them for whatever political purposes he might have in the future because they basically owe him. So there are lots of different ways to read that particular pardon. And again, much like I had drawn comparisons with our current political situation in Washington, what we see behind or what we see publicly can be very different than perhaps what occurs behind closed doors. And that's part of what this particular play exhibits. But regardless of his motivation, Bolingbroke, aka Henry IV, does indeed pardon Omer. And then at the very ending of the play, what we've got is Richard's private lament. And if Richard ever takes responsibility at all for his actions, it's got to be here. And this is where he says, and this is in Act 5, Scene 5, line 1 or so is where he begins. And this is a long, long speech. It begins on line 1 and it ends around line 65 or so. And I'll just take the middle of it around line 43. How sour sweet music is when time is broke and no proportion kept. So it is in the music of men's lives, and here have I the daintiness of ear, to check time broke in a disordered string. But for the concord of my state and time, had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time, and now time doth waste me. So I said that's perhaps my favorite line in the play. For now hath time made me his numbing clock. My thoughts are minutes, and with sighs they jar their watches onto on mine eyes, the outward watch, whereto my finger like a dial's point is pointing still and cleansing them from tears. So certainly we know that Richard feels regret. The question is, does he feel regret that he's hurt his kingdom? Or does he feel regret that he has lost his kingdom? And those are two separate things. And as I was indicating with many of your responses to Tragic Hero, can we say that Richard accepts responsibility at the end? Finally, at the end, Richard, after his private lament, Act 5, Scene 5, line 84 or so, as he's continuing on, he talks about his jealousy. And he says, so proud that Bolingbroke was on his back. He's talking about his horse. That jade that had eat bread from my royal hand, that hath made him proud with clapping him. Would he not stumble? Would he not fall down? Since pride must have a fall, and break the neck of that proud man that doth usurp his back. Forgiveness, horse, why do I rail on thee? Since thou, created to be awed by man, was born to bear? I was not made a horse, and yet I bear brethren like an ass. So even Richard's horse has abandoned him by this particular point. And then finally, of course, we've got the very ending where Richard has been assassinated. And the idea is, or at least what Bolingbroke is arguing, is that he's completely innocent. He never wanted anyone to assassinate Richard, so Bolingbroke says. But Bolingbroke did say out loud it would be very nice if Richard wasn't alive. So you can see this as either an innocent mistake from Bolingbroke, a miscalculation, or this was very deliberate in that Bolingbroke was hopeful that someone might take action, and then Bolingbroke could claim a certain level of innocence. And then in Act 5, Scene 6, line 34 or so, this is where basically Bolingbroke, as King Henry, says to Exton, the assassinator, Exton, I thank thee not, for thou hast wrought a deed of slander with thy fatal hand upon my head and all this famous land. And then Exton says, from your own mouth, my lord, did I this deed. And King Henry, or Bolingbroke, says, they love not poison that do poison need, nor do I thee. Though I did wish him dead, I hate the murderer, loved him murdered. The guilt of conscience take thou for thy labor. For neither my good word nor princely favor with king go wander through the shades of night, and never show thy head by day nor light. Lords, I protest my soul is full of woe, that blood should sprinkle me to make me grow. Come mourn with me for what I do lament, and put on sullen black, incontinent. I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land, to wash this blood off from my guilty hand. March sadly after, grace my mornings here, in weeping after this untimely bier. So next class, what I thought we could do is put some closure onto Richard, if there are any odds or ends that we haven't gotten to. And then we can move forward to the tragedies and also talking about Macbeth. And for today's attendance question, which would be due on Thursday, the 8th of April at 8 a.m., which one is, or what is one of your favorite Richard II quotes? It could be one of the quotes I identified, or perhaps one of the quotes that I didn't have a chance to identify. But in the play, which one is one of your favorite quotes and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will proceed forward with tragedies. Take care. Bye-bye.